Hello and welcome back to Historical American Girl Read-Alouds with Mrs. Mansfield. I'm here today to read the end of the book, Meet Kit, to you. Meet Kit. We finished the story, but at the end of each of the American Girl books, there's a part called Looking Back, and it tells some things about life during the time period that the girl lived in, 1934 for Kit. I decided today that Kit should be in her bed. She should be reading a book while we're reading. She's wearing her pajamas and she's nice and cozy, so she can listen to the story along with us. So a look back at America in 1934. When Kit's father closed his business, the Kittredges found themselves facing hard times that were shared by millions of Americans. In 1924, America had fallen into a financial crisis so serious that it came to be known as the Great Depression. Businesses and banks all across the country had to close for lack of money. Some people lost their jobs and sometimes their life savings. Families often had no way to pay for the things they needed to live, such as groceries and rent. So the picture at the top on this page shows the long lines of people that are looking for work or waiting for a meal. It was common during the Depression. So you can see the sign on the building says for rent, this entire building. So all the businesses within that building had gone out of business. And you can see that line stretches way down the street and around the corner. And then down at the bottom, you see a picture where some people had all their things set out on the street when they couldn't afford their homes anymore. People found creative ways to cope with the hard times. They planted gardens and raised animals for food, recycled everything they could, and made things they couldn't afford to buy. To save money, many families moved in together. Others turned their homes into boarding houses, as Kit's family did. But as the Depression deepened, many people ended up homeless and started wandering America in search of food and jobs. There had been depressions in America's past, but none as widespread and long-lasting as the Great Depression. Although the start of the Great Depression in 1929 took many Americans by surprise, the causes had been building for many years. The picture at the bottom of this page shows to find work, many people traveled the country by hopping onto slow-moving trains, a dangerous and illegal thing to do. Sometimes whole families rode the rails together. That's what they called hopping onto a train, was riding the rails. At the top of this page, it said families who kept chickens made money by selling eggs. So people who had never raised chickens before, maybe lived in subdivisions like ours, suddenly started keeping chickens and raising the eggs to sell and to feed their family. The 1920s had been good years for American business. World War I, the Great War, ended in 1918, and American companies switched from making war supplies to making things like radios, toasters, and cars. Americans supported business growth by buying stock in the companies making these and other goods. A stock is a share of a company, and the stock market is a system in which people buy and sell shares. The stock market is an important measure of the health of America's financial system or economy. People invest in stocks when they have confidence in the economy and believe they'll make money. The picture at the bottom of the page is a stock certificate. People who bought stock in a company often received a stock certificate showing the number of shares they owned. and the stock market's still around today. At the top of the page, it showed cars from the 1920s. We talked about in an earlier episode how cars had been made affordable finally. And then there's a picture of an old-fashioned radio. By the end of the 1920s, nearly every American home had a radio. And we'll talk about radios again at the end. For a time in the 1920s, stock values went up and people did make lots of money. But some investors bought more stock than they could afford. They bought stock on credit or with borrowed money. They believed their stock would increase in value. They planned to repay their loans when they sold their stock at a higher price. But the economy was getting out of balance as it grew. Business owners and investors were making huge profits, but the wages of working people didn't rise very fast. Many people went into debt, buying everyday things on credit. Farmers were already in debt from years of struggling with drought and low crop prices. As people's debt grew, they stopped buying new things. Companies lost money, so they laid off workers, and then even fewer people could afford new things. Stocks were worth less and less. Confidence in the economy fell. Investors began to sell their stocks, but soon the stocks were worth so little that no one wanted to buy them. And so there's pictures on this page at the bottom of a man looking at the newspaper to find out what the stock prices were. There's some advertisements that kind of encourage people to buy on credit. Credit, as it explained in the book, is when you don't have the money now, but you pay a little bit and then more each month. And so that's called on credit. They're crediting it to you thinking that you're going to be able to pay it back. And then at the very top, it's showing all the styles and fashions and things that people had in the 1920s, right before the Depression. Then on October 29th, 1929, a day that became known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed when stock prices dropped dramatically. Many investors lost everything. They could not pay back the money they had borrowed to buy stocks. The banks that had loaned them money lost everything too. Within weeks, the entire country started to suffer as businesses and banks shut down and more people lost their jobs. Almost overnight, people who had been comfortable found themselves with nothing. When a bank closed, people were sometimes left with only the money they had at home. So when you put money in the bank, you assume that you'll be able to get all of it out when you need it. But at this time, banks were run a little bit differently. And when all of these problems happened, banks closed and you couldn't get all the money that you had in the bank that you were saving. So you see a picture of somebody selling their expensive car for only $100. You see a man holding a sign asking for work. And you see pictures of people panicking when the stock prices fell on Wall Street. Even children who had put their pennies and nickels into school-sponsored savings programs lost their money. Many people had nowhere to turn for help and were deeply ashamed to go on relief or to accept free meals in soup kitchens run by charities. For most, it was the first time they had to rely on charity. But with so many people in need, the charities soon ran out of money too. Families and neighbors helped one another as much as they could, but often there was not enough to go around. Like the Kittredges, some families did all right during the first few years of the Depression, but few escaped the hard times entirely. Many children suffered. One West Virginia teacher noticed a student having trouble paying attention during class. When the girl didn't eat at lunchtime, the teacher suggested that the girl run home to get her lunch. She couldn't, the girl replied, because it was Tuesday, her sister's day to eat. And so the picture there shows a lot of kids having trouble staying awake because they didn't have enough to eat. It made them sleepy. And at the top it shows people going to food pantries and charities to get food. President Herbert Hoover did little to provide leadership or government help. He believed that business, if left alone, would correct itself and the Depression would end. But as the hard times got worse, many Americans lost confidence in the president and in the government. In the fall of 1930, the International Apple Shippers Association tried to help unemployed workers by selling them apples at $1.75 a crate. By selling the apples for 5 cents each, a seller could make $1.85 profit. Thousands of unemployed workers turned to apple selling. Within weeks, however, the supply of apples ran out, and so did the jobs. So you can see in the picture there people just selling apples. It says by early November of 1930, there were 6,000 apple sellers on the streets of New York City. In the picture you can see like 6 of them lined up in a row there. At the top of the page it shows a picture which says, "Homeless people built rough shacks for shelter." Angry Americans called these communities Hoovervilles, after President Hoover, who appeared to do nothing to end the Depression. During the Depression, people looked for ways to forget their troubles. Many homes had radios, and families gathered to listen to the adventures of Little Orphan Annie and Buck Rogers, or to the comedy team of George Burns and Gracie Allen. Movie theaters started offering all-day shows for a nickel, and they were soon filled with people trying to escape reality by watching Cary Grant, Jean Harlow, and Greta Garbo on the screen. The year 1932, when Kit's story begins, was the lowest point of the Great Depression, but no one knew it at the time. Unemployment was at an all-time high, and the future looked bleak. In November, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would be elected president, beating President Hoover by a landslide. That means a lot. Americans were desperate for a change, and they hoped the new president would lead them out of the Depression. And so you see at the bottom pictures of people with posters asking people to vote for Roosevelt. Row, row, row with Roosevelt in the one picture there. And at the top you see pictures of Shirley Temple, who was a little girl who was able to dance and sing and act in all kinds of movies at that time. She started when she was 3 years old acting. So at that time in history, there weren't TVs or internet or anything like that. So people had books to entertain them and games and friends and things like that. But then they also listened to the radio, it mentioned. And it said that that's how one of the ways that they escaped, besides going to movies, which they did have. They would also listen to the radio. So this is Kit's radio for Kit's family. And the neat thing about the radio, this radio, is it actually plays things from the 1930s. You never know what you're going to get when you turn it on. You can get any of a series of things. Sometimes it plays music from the 1930s. Sometimes it plays news reports, because they would get their news on the radio. Sometimes it plays advertisements for things that you might hear. And one of the recorded messages is of President Roosevelt. After he was elected president, he started doing something called fireside chats. So in the evenings, the idea was families could gather around their fire, a fireside, and listen to the president talk about his ideas on how to help the country recover from the Depression, and just words of encouragement that made them feel better. So I'm going to play these for you. We'll see what we get the first time around here.
The President of the United States. My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes to the people of the United States about banking. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days and why it was done and what the next steps are going to be.
So that one was President Roosevelt. That was the actual recording of his voice. And he was saying, if you couldn't quite understand him, that he was going to tell them what the government had done and what the next steps were going to be. So you probably noticed that it's not real clear. It's nowhere near as clear as the radios that you're used to listening to, or TV. And it was kind of muffled because the technology was new. So let's see what we hear next.
That little ditty is a fave of mine.
He said, that little ditty is a fave of mine. Ditty like a song. So that would have been the music that was popular for teenagers, adults, and everyone. It was kind of a jazz type of sound. Let's see what we hear next.
A light rain fell this morning on hundreds of unemployed men and their families waiting outside of a soup kitchen on Cincinnati's River Street. The line of hungry men, women, and children ran all the way down the block. Inside, volunteers served hot soup, a piece of bread, and milk for the children.
So that was a news report. You might have been able to hear that he was talking about all of the people waiting in line at soup kitchens to get food. He said long lines of men, women, and children went around the block.
Love that reggae music.
So that was ragtime music that was popular, which was piano music with that kind of a beat. There's a famous song called The Entertainer that is in that style of music too.
Now you can get the brand new modern washing machine from Rushmore. It has the most contemporary design with a wringer and plenty of room to spin laundry. And don't forget the Suds laundry detergent. Use Suds when you wash your clothes for the cleanest washing house.
So that one was about the latest washing machine, which was an advertisement for buying it, which I just happen to have. So let me show you Kit's washing machine. So this is the washing machine from Kit's time period. They would put clothes through here in between those two rollers and turn the handle, and that would roll the clothes through that. And so it would kind of wring the water out into the washing machine. They could put the clothes in there and then turn this little spinner. Kind of has a spinner like what we have today. So you can see how the clothes would go through and get wrung out. And then they would go down in here and they would be washed kind of like our washing machines. A lot of them today still have that in it. But then they would be wrung out through that. So that's what they were advertising on that last part of the radio broadcast. Well, that's it for my friend Kit. There she is. We finished the first book, Meet Kit. I think my plan for the next book will be to read a Josefina story. So in a couple weeks, I will start reading some Josefina books to you. In the meantime, take care and thanks for listening in.